Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Rob from Truth Speaks Clearly. Um, and I just wanted to briefly give my experience and take on being an INTP. Now, just to be uh, clear up front, I actually have not taken the official Myers-Briggs test. But I have taken a number of free personality tests, uh, just maybe three different kinds, multiple times, just to see, make sure I'm kind of answering questions in a similar fashion, and just making sure that my results are accurate. But anyway, 9 times out of 10. I would say, 90, 95, 99% of the time I have always registered as an INTP. So I'm pretty sure, I don't need to take the Myers-Briggs test. If you understand the cognitive functions and you understand how, dominant or not they are in your life, then you kind of don't need to take the test because you can kind of figure it out on your own and see what resonates with you and how, which cognitive functions play out in your life. So I'm just going to go through the top four for INTP and give my own personal experience of how this affects me. And, I was one of the people who, when I first took my very first personality test, I think the first one I took was 16personalities.com. The description of my type was spot on. And it was actually the first time in my life that I'd ever had something that I truly identified with, because for those of you that are INTP, or for those who just know about, a little bit about Myers-Briggs, INTPs are not the most common type at all. In fact, any kind of NTs in general are going to be very underrepresented in culture. It seems like culture is pretty much dominated by SJs when you look at the distribution. But I always knew I was different, but I didn't know if it was. I didn't know if I was different because I had flaws, or if I was just different because, I'm just a quirky person. So for me, it was really cool to see that, okay, like there's a reason, or sort of a method to the madness with which I approach life. So, with that being said, let me just get to the functions. So first is introverted thinking. And this is this was a big one for me, because I literally recall when I was younger, my father, who I don't think is an INT, I don't think he's introverted at all. He's a thinker, but he's a little bit more extroverted. But he used to tell me all the time. He would say, "You need to get out of your own head. You're just in your own world, and you need to get up and, take out the trash or do this or do that." I was definitely a procrastinator all through my life. I would still get things done in a reasonable time, but I would wait till the last minute to do something. Like, if I didn't have to do something in that exact moment, then I was not going to do it. And I felt totally comfortable doing that because I knew in the back of my mind I would get around to it. But again, I think with my dad was definitely a judger, in that he used to always flip out or freak out if I didn't do things like ahead of time, But with the introverted thinking thing, I definitely, even to this day, and even when I was a kid, I pretty much live in my head. It's almost as if the reality that is in my mind is almost more real and more tangible than the physical reality that I live in. And, introverted sensing, when I get to it, I think plays a role in that, because, when your thinking is done kind of internally and subjectively, and then you pair that with introverted sensing, which is basically, experiencing the world less from a standpoint of, physical touch and, physical, you know, um, physical features of the outside world, but instead experiencing the world outside of you from more of an impressionistic standpoint, or kind of like the subjective imprint that certain events left on you. What ends up happening is, you know the world you live in, because you're so much in your head and everything is so internal, that internal reality is almost, you almost spend more time there than you do in the outer world. And that's why, one of the stereotypes with INTPs that can have some truth is that they are not always the cleanest, or in terms of their environment, or even the way they dress. They may be a little unkempt in some ways. I mean, you've got the classic Albert Einstein crazy hair situation. And I think that that's a reflection of somebody who spends a lot of their time and focus in their head thinking. Another thing, when it comes to introverted thinking, the more that I've learned about it, the more I kind of see how it plays out. So, introverted thinking is also about not only thinking logically, but also subjectively kind of constructing a framework, and almost like an outline or backbone or skeleton of how everything works. Everything, even things that don't have any kind of like things that may potentially not have an explanation, like or that we can understand, like the origin of the universe. Like, introverted thinking seeks to find the true kind of structure of anything. It could be a concept, it could be an idea, whether it's the structure of a modern relationship between a boy and a girl, and how does that work, and what are the dynamics involved in that situation. How does that thing work as a system, and kind of subjectively piecing together this form of what this thing is, just as if you would kind of construct a sketch or an outline for a concept car. So I always have this desire, when I come across something interesting, to really understand how it works. But the interesting thing is that a lot of the things that I find interested in are things that are very difficult to map out. Things like emotions, things like quantum theory, and all these. These things are super interesting, but who's to know what actually lies behind those things? Maybe what lies behind it is a lot of random activity that actually has no structure in itself. But with my introverted thinking, I would want to figure out something, like, well, how does the randomness work? But also, just in general, when I was in school, one of the big things for me that I noticed, especially in college, was that when I would sit in class and listen to a teacher speak, 95% of the stuff that I heard would go in one ear and out the other, unless I was just super interested in it. And the reason was because a lot of the teachers they weren't teaching things systematically, or they weren't teaching things in such a way that they kind of built up to this grand picture or system to explain what we were doing. So, I'd come into a class, and it'd be calculus or whatever, and the teacher would crack open chapter 5 and start talking about this theory and that, equation. And I'm just sitting there like, why are we doing this? What is this for? Like, when would I ever use this? What is the context of, like, what is the meaning behind all, like, what is the context or, system from which this equation came forth? Why did it come forth? Why is it necessary? Why do I even need to do it? And so what I would end up having to do, especially for my finals, is I would literally take the textbook. It didn't matter what the I did the homework assignments just to, do them and get my grades. But if I wanted to actually understand the material, what I had to do was I had to open my textbook and literally read every chapter from beginning to end, from the first word to the last word, because most of the textbooks that I had were written in a way that was fairly logical, kind of building upon, hey, this equation is, was invented by this person who needed, because they needed a way to solve for this. Because a lot of college courses are they're extremely accelerated, so they often will skip around. They'll say, read pages 56 to 70 and then read page 140 to one, so they're skipping all around. And I would struggle because when I get information, I need to, I have a need to connect that information to a larger framework, a bigger picture. I want to know what's the big picture, and then start telling me about all the details. Like, don't start with the details and then jump around, and then eventually, like, one day you talk about how this all fits together. Like, no, like, start with the big idea, then start drilling down. Like, that's how I prefer to learn. And it was really interesting for me growing up because, on one hand, there were a lot of people who maybe they were extroverted thinkers or whatever, but there were a lot of people in my classes who were able to learn by just sitting in and listening to a teacher and hearing them ramble. And they were able to kind of pick up on things pretty quickly. And I mean, for the most part, if I really paid attention, I could as well, but it wasn't as natural for me. So I always had this weird, I always felt a little weird because in order for me to understand things, it seems like I had to. It took me longer to understand it because at the time I didn't know that. Hey, not everybody thinks like me. Some people don't need to know the reasoning behind something. They're satisfied with just knowing on the surface level that, like, okay, I know that this is the name of the equation, and I know this is what it looks like, and I know this is how it works, and that's all they need to know, and they're good to move on. Like, that doesn't work for me if I don't have context or an idea of why this thing even exists. I will likely just not remember it because I won't have anything to tie it to in order to recall it or think of situations in which it might be used. Another thing with introverted thinking is it kind of sucks when I'm talking with people because I will be very animated about the things that I'm interested in and talking about, but then as soon as the other person starts talking, if they're not kind of talking about something that I care about as well, I will almost subconsciously tune out and just go back to my thoughts in my head. And sometimes I'll be looking right at them, but I won't be thinking about what they're saying. I'll be thinking about like the intentions behind what they're saying. I see their mouth moving, but like maybe I'm looking at, and this could be part of this could be some of my FE kicking in, but I start wondering about like, where's that person at? I'm looking at like their body language. I'm looking at like other things beyond what they're actually saying. Which sucks for a lot of people. And also, just living in a world, I work in a business environment, and being in an environment that is dominated by extroverted people who expect you to be, super duper outgoing and I mean, God, there's nothing that drains my energy more than small talk, just because it's out of all the amazing things in this universe to have to sit, and stand in an elevator with somebody and talk about the weather, and it really is a drag, to say the least, because I just don't care. But at the same time, it's not really acceptable within that environment to kind of just tell somebody, hey, I actually don't give a shit about what you're talking about. So if you could just, either shut up or try to talk about something more entertaining. And that's not to say that, look, everybody's different. And I know some of the things that I'm interested in, a lot of people are like, that's the weirdest thing I've ever heard of. And, I have no interest in that myself. So, I'm not saying that I'm, a conversation, or I'm not saying that I'm such a high intellectual that I can't speak about common things, or that I don't enjoy, for example, talking about sports or something, but the small talk is definitely a drag. And I definitely sometimes have this negative feeling towards people who are like super duper happy all the time, and like super duper talkative, and like super duper positive. Even though I do believe in, I think positive thinking is beneficial, but sometimes uh, people who are just constantly talking and constantly energetic, for me, can be a little bit too over the top for my taste. But again, we're all just different, so it's not like their way is wrong. That's just them, and I'm just me. It's just, unfortunately, introverts are definitely uh, they're again, they're just not as popular. And I don't think it's a negative thing. I'm not a religious person, but I definitely have looked into some of the Eastern philosophies, and I think one of the things that resonates with me from some of those teachings is kind of this this element to nature in which things are multiple things. They're not just one thing or another. So, for example, being introverted is not necessarily a negative thing or a positive thing. It kind of is both at the same time. It has its negatives, it has its positives, just depending on how you look at it. Similar to a knife, a knife could, be used to slice your grandma's pie, and or it could be used to stab somebody. So it's not that it's one thing or the other. It's all the possibilities in which it could be used for is kind of what it is, even though that may not be the intention of the person who invented it. So I don't want to go on this whole tangent of being introverted being a negative thing. I don't think it's not a negative thing from my perspective. It just depends on what situation you're in and how you're perceiving that situation. But anyway, so anything else about introverted thinking? I think that pretty much covers it. But the other thing that I want to mention about introverted thinking is that and I think this is common with everybody's dominant function, whatever it happens to be. Like, it's not something I can't turn it off. Like, I don't sit down and say, okay, I'm gonna do some introverted thinking necessarily. It's just constantly on. All day, every day, from the moment I wake up to the moment I go to sleep. It's just on. It's the way I experience reality is like just in my head, and I'm always thinking about things. Even when I like resting, to me, like if I lay down somewhere, it's very hard for me to lay down and not think about things, which is why I find practices like meditation actually, somewhat helpful, because, to a degree, the point of meditation is to, uh, try to clear your head for a second and kind of just, you know, um, be calm and be still for a little while. Remember you're, a human being, and, things will be all right. And, just lets you kind of calm down. So that's introverted thinking. Extroverted intuition is a funny one, because this is the part of me that uh, I think a lot of people are interested in, and makes me a little more likable in general. Is that I do have a lot of different interests. I have a lot of different. I'm just interested in a lot of possibilities, and my extroverted intuition actually helps me to be a little bit more outgoing, talk to people, meet new people, because a lot of times I am genuinely interested in meeting interesting people or finding out interesting things about other people, even though I don't necessarily have a craving to kind of hang out with them in this like long term sense, because I want to go away into my little, bubble or whatever and do my introverted thinking thing. But I genuinely do enjoy learning about a lot of shit, because I think through learning about a lot of different things, it feeds my introverted thinking, but it also helps my extroverted intuition in terms of making new connections and kind of having new ideas about things. Because the more kind of objects or concepts that I have to play with, the more creative I can be in creating new solutions. So one thing is that I like a lot is brainstorming. I love going into a situation where, a company or a business says, hey, here's what we're trying to do with our company, here's what we're trying to achieve, and we just need ideas. Like, I love doing that kind of stuff because I love coming up with novel solutions, new ideas, new concepts, new ways to do things, because I get easily bored by a lot of things, and that's been something that's made it a challenge for me in terms of mastering any certain skills or crafts, is because once I understand how something works with my kind of introverted thinking, then my extroverted intuition kicks in, and I kind of like just want to start connecting what I know about that to something else, which leads me to then go down a different rabbit trail to learn about some whole other thing because of some very loose connection between those two things, between that new thing and the thing that I just learned about. And then once I learn about that new thing and I learn about how it relates to the original thing I learned, then that sparks another idea about, okay, if this system works like this and that system works like that, and they're kind of related in this sense, then that must mean that this other thing, which I haven't even looked into yet, must be true. So let me go look at that to confirm if my hypothesis is correct. And in a lot of situations, my ideas have been correct, which is it's kind of a cool process. Also, my extrovert intuition gives me a wide taste in all kinds of music, all kinds of entertainment, all kinds of different people, all kinds of different ideologies, because I don't care. I just want to learn about it. And my introverted thinking has a desire to try to figure out the logic behind it, even if it is a flawed logic. So, one of the things that I find fascinating, which I read about a long time ago in, of all books, Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. One of the things he says early on in that book is that you have to understand how people see themselves, to help you kind of understand how you can better position yourself to kind of be in good standing with that person. And one of the things he said was, if you ever notice, a lot of the biggest criminals of all time who have been captured, when they get interviewed, even when they're in jail, sentenced, doing time, and they get interviewed, a lot of them still maintain their innocence, even though, there may be hardcore evidence showing that, they probably did what they did. But even if they admit to what they did, they don't necessarily feel that it was the wrong thing to do. So one of the things that I have found fascinating is just trying to figure out the logic behind a lot of these seemingly ridiculous actions that people take, because even though, a lot of times I find their reasoning to be flawed, it's interesting to see how the thought process they had that led them to that conclusion. And again, it just goes back to the fact that I feel like the more I understand about the world around me, the better I can kind of build this grand master system in my head about how the world works, how people work, how a lot of different things work. Before I go on to introverted sensing, one other thing that I want to call out about introverted thinking that is really interesting and can sometimes be a little bit troubling, not troubling personally for me, but troubling in the sense of the fact that I know this form of thinking could lead to conclusions that would make the common person very uncomfortable. Introverted thinking, for the most part, is pretty much devoid of anything to do with human emotions, unless it's taking in emotions as just another kind of like, component of a larger structure. But what I mean is, introverted thinking is not concerned with whether a conclusion is disturbing or counterculture. It only cares about the logic and reasoning that leads to the conclusion. And if the logic and reasoning is solid, then it doesn't really matter what the conclusion is. So I think this is partially why a lot of INTPs are more likely to be atheists. I wouldn't necessarily call myself an atheist. Will say about myself is, as far as I know, I don't see any sign of any kind of personal deity. But again, if such a thing were to exist, who's to say that, it had some kind of properties that were, non-detectable by humans or something. I don't know, but I don't think that, a God exists, a personal God exists necessarily. But then again, like, I can't prove that it doesn't. So, it's just kind of like, from a practical standpoint, I don't really, if I can't prove that it exists or that it doesn't, or I can't see, what good does it really do me to kind of fashion my life based on something that I can't necessarily prove to be true or not? It's kind of like, it's like basic. I'm fashioning my life on a gamble that this thing might exist. Like, I'm not into that. If anything, I think I'm a little bit more. I think I find some of the Eastern philosophies a little bit more interesting. Because they're a little bit more just observable, just kind of like, most Eastern philosophies don't believe in like a personal God. It's more about like, there is a way of life, or there is kind of like this common energy in all things, which I think makes some sense, because if, for example, if the Big Bang Theory were true, who knows if it is or not, then you could say in a sense, yeah, we kind of all come from a similar source. But whether that source is personal, most of the Eastern religions seem to think that that's not the case. So that's my spiel on that. But I say all that to say this, one of the things, for an example, that I've thought about is the existence of, and one of the things that's been heavily debated is, does objective morality exist? Objective morality, in the sense of, is right and wrong anything more than opinion? Is there a sense, in which something is absolutely right or absolutely wrong from a moral standpoint? And I'm going to be honest, from my perspective, from what I know about the universe, I have not seen any evidence to support that, objective morality in that sense exists. That doesn't mean that I am just going to go do whatever the hell I want, because whether morality is objective or not, there are consequences to be considered for the actions that you take. But, a lot of people are not comfortable even having that type of conversation, because they're afraid of the potential implications of such a notion. But, again, introverted thinking doesn't care about the implications of necessarily of a conclusion. It's more of, is the conclusion true or not? If it's true, then it really doesn't matter how people feel about it or what they think about it. It's like if somebody were to get upset that the sky was blue. It's like, well, okay, you can be upset about it all you want. It's not going to change what is. It's not going to change the facts. So again, like, I'm open to hearing people's takes on certain things, but at the end of the day, I think for things myself, and I make my own conclusions. And this caused some issues when I was growing up. I feel like my mother was definitely a I don't think she was an intuitive. She was definitely like I think she was definitely an extroverted sensor. And she was just like, she would kind of shout commands and expect me to do things. And I'm just sitting there like, why do I have to do that? Why should I do that? It seems like this would be a better way or that would be a better. And she's just like, don't talk back, just do what I say. And it used to drive me nuts. And I used to get in trouble a lot about that. And that was one of the main reasons I wanted to get out of my house when I was younger. Is just like, I was like, these people just believe in things. And my parents were also fairly religious. And I'm just sitting there like, I'm like, these people base their entire life worldview on something that cannot be proven. I'm like, this doesn't seem logical. And to this day, I don't think it is. I was overall a pretty good kid. I didn't like clash with my parents hardcore, but I definitely just didn't agree with a lot of the things that they did and didn't always follow the rules exactly, as any teenager does. So that's one thing to call out about introverted thinking. It is pretty much unconcerned with, feelings or people or right and wrong, or it's just concerned about accuracy and truth. What's true, what's real? Like, how does this thing work? How does the world work? What's true about this concept? What's true about this thought, this idea? And that's it. Like, you know, that's all that matters. So those are the two kind of leading functions: introverted thinking and extroverted intuition. The other thing I'll say is with extroverted intuition, sometimes I have to consciously tap into that, but once I do, I am comfortable using it. For example, when it comes to brainstorming, I can consciously brainstorm for a period of time, and I enjoy it. But also, there are times where there's a sense in which extroverted intuition is kind of always on as well. In that, when I am talking with people, and I know this is probably super annoying, and I've probably done it a couple times just in this recording, is I will, if I'm just having casual conversation with somebody and they could bring up something about sports, I will almost instantly make a connection between what they said to something that has nothing to do with what we were talking about. But I mean, the connection I will be able to demonstrate the connection. For example, let's say somebody starts talking about the Patriots winning the Super Bowl. And that might lead me to think of, Aaron Hernandez, who's in jail, a former Patriot who's in jail for, potentially killing somebody. I think he was convicted. I think he is convicted. And then, that will lead me to think about, the violent streets of Southside Chicago, because I like some of the rappers that came out. So I have to sometimes stop myself from just going on these crazy tangents. And this has happened to me multiple times where I'll be in a conversation with somebody and I'll literally say to them, like, I know this doesn't, like, this sounds kind of random, but like, or I'll say, not to change the subject, but that reminds me of this. And, so I'm constantly kind of seeing connections between things, not as much as somebody who would have extroverted intuition as their dominant lead function, but it definitely is like an underlying, constantly present thing that typically feeds into and feeds off of my introverted thinking. So introverted sensing is something that seems to be one of the harder things to explain for people, and I don't know if it's as understood as it can be. To be honest, it's not something that, I don't think it's something that's as mystical or magical as like introverted intuition or something like that. So I think a lot of people are not even really super duper concerned about it. And I would say even with myself, like, I don't spend a whole lot of time looking into introverted sensing. I have studied it quite a bit, but from what I can gather from it, it's pretty simple of a concept, and from the way I live my life and how I experience it, I think it's pretty simple. But essentially, Introverted sensing, like I said before, is like, well, first let me talk about extroverted sensing as a contrast. So extroverted sensing is being focused on the details around you in the physical world, like being very aware of like touch, taste, feel, smell, as well as kind of concrete facts and concepts and data and information, kind of like the surface level of what something is. Like, this is concrete, this is, oh, like this person just punched me, I'm gonna punch them back. Whereas introverted sensing is more about when an event happens. It's more about it instead of your consciousness kind of making a log of the like physical outward characteristics of what happened. What ends up getting logged into your consciousness is kind of the impression that you got from what happened. So, for example, I got in a fist fight with somebody one time. It was somebody who I knew. It wasn't too bad. It was pretty mild. But the thing that I remember most about that moment was not, how many punches I landed or how many punches they landed. And in fact, what was really interesting is this person punched me at one point and I fell to the ground. And I don't know, maybe this is just adrenaline, but I actually didn't feel at the time, I didn't feel any of the punches. And I think even afterwards, I didn't really feel any of the punches that I got hit with. The only thing that I remember from that moment was I was thinking about how I was thinking about, I won't even say thinking, but it left an impression on my consciousness. The impression was more about, I don't know if it's necessarily how I felt about the moment, but it was kind of like how I perceived that moment. So I recall from that moment like how I recall how crazy it was because people were like cheering all around, and how it was in a high school, and how kids get when there's a fight, and they're like, and I just remember kind of my adrenaline being high. I remember kind of just shutting off my thinking, all my introverted thinking, and just trying to I kind of go into this like animalistic mode of trying to survive in this like physical fight, which is not something that I got into very often. So I remember all these other things about it, other outside of just like the physical things that happened or the details of like I couldn't tell you like what time it happened at. I don't remember if it was at lunch. I don't remember if it was later in the day. I don't fucking remember. Maybe it was like the school I went to, they had lunch and then they also had like this short break period. I don't know which one of those periods it was. Like I don't even remember what year it was. I couldn't tell you if I was a freshman or a senior or a junior. I don't remember. Those are all details that an extroverted sensor would remember. The things I remember are more of they're of a subjective nature. That's the word I'm looking for. It's a subjective impression of what happened, not an objective impression of what happened. An objective impression would be, which would be extroverted sensing, would be, okay, me and my friend fought at this location and I hit him twice. He landed 5 punches on me, one to my jaw, one to my like that's extroverted sensing. For me, it's more like my subjective interpretation of what happened. So, and I can't really explain it, but it's kind of like the best way I can explain it is the feeling of nostalgia when if you ever see something that you used to be a fan of a long time ago when you were a kid and you see it now, like maybe an old, Nintendo system, that feeling that comes up within you. It's not necessarily an emotion. It part of it's an emotion, but part of it is like it's more of like this recollection of everything that you remember about life at the time that you kind of experience that object that you're looking at. You're not worried so much about like, oh yeah, look at the color of the object, and look at the, you're like, you get, there's this impression that comes up within you of all these sort of memories that are attached to the time that you lived in, when, and everything that happened when you had that thing in your life. So it's more like that. It's like a subjective impression, or I don't want, I'm trying to avoid saying feeling, because I don't want to get that confused with introverted feeling or extroverted feeling. It's more of just like a, almost like a recollection of memory, and of how, of your state at that time. But and this is also something that causes I think this is also one of those reasons why they say INTPs are more subjective to addictions, because when we see something that we maybe used to be addicted to, or are becoming addicted to, that impression, similar to like nostalgia, how you get that sense inside of you, that like resonates deeply within you, like, oh man, like this thing is like bringing back memories. We get that same thing for things that we get addicted to. So it could be cigarettes, it could be whatever. And I've had my fair share of issues with addiction. I'm not going to get into it on this, thing here, but I've definitely dealt with it, and it's very powerful, and it also makes it a little bit harder for me to, as much as I love new things, and my extroverted intuition kind of kicks in terms of like learning new things. The way I go about learning them, the way I take in information, the way I kind of carry myself on a day-to-day basis tends to kind of fall into a routine, which I don't mind breaking, and I can break, and I actually am comfortable breaking routines, because I'm more of a, and I don't know if this has to do with me being more of a perceiver than a judger, because I'm very open to just kind of being like, sure, let's see how things go with this like different thing or whatever. But I think part of it's my introverted sensing that kind of makes me feel very comfortable doing things that are familiar to me. Lastly, looking at extroverted feeling, which is my inferior function. This one is really interesting, because this function is literally for most of my adult life, I considered to be one of my greatest weaknesses, and a great annoyance, because for all the introverted thinking that I do, and I follow things through to very logical conclusions, devoid of feeling. Once I arrived at those conclusions, and seek to carry, and if I'm like, okay, I figured out this is what I need to do, fuck everybody's opinions, this is what makes sense for me, and this is what I'm gonna do. Extroverted feeling kind of comes in and just fucks all that up. And it took off a little bit more as I got older, which I think is the norm. But for example, one of the things that I feel is true in general, I'm not happy that it's true, but one of the things that I find to be fairly accurate is that if you are fairly intelligent and you also don't care about other people, you will often do better in life than somebody who does care deeply about other people, sometimes. And I'll give you an example. Somebody say somebody's a salesman and they have something that they need to sell, and it may not necessarily be in the best interest of the consumer to buy this thing from you, but logically that it will do you great good to sell this thing to them. Then, in that situation, because you don't care, you personally, at least in the short run, and assuming that this is not somebody that you would have to do business with in the future, and they're like all upset because you sold them crap, but in the short run at least, you would kind of have an advantage of by not caring about that person, because you would say, you wouldn't even think about it. You'd be like, I don't care what this person, if this is good for them or not. I need to make money, and I'm going to do this. And there are people who succeed and do well in business with that attitude. But there's also, and also when you don't care about what other people think, or you don't care about them at all, you tend to be a little bit more driven to kind of do your own thing and do what you want to do, because you don't really give a shit about what other people think. Whereas in my case with extroverted feeling, I sometimes will arrive at a logical conclusion, but then when I try to do something like, act in such a way that is, disregard, that's doesn't take anybody's emotion into account, or anybody's, emotional state into account, I often find myself struggling with that, because my FE will kick in. It's something that I don't consciously try to tap into. It's just there. It's part of who I am. So much so that I've tried to suppress it, but it's to the point now where I just have to accept that it's there. And the way that I've kind of reconciled that with my introverted thinking is that I know consciously that that is part of kind of the way that my brain kind of perceives the environment, this extroverted feeling. However, just because my brain is perceiving that emotion or whatever doesn't mean that I need to base my decisions and actions upon it. So that's kind of how I reconcile it with my introverted thinking. It's like, okay, I have feelings coming up, or I can pick up on feeling on how somebody else might be feeling, or the feeling in the room a little bit. Like, I'm not like super good at it, but I can kind of pick up on things. But I don't have to because I consciously know that that is happening, then I can consciously kind of let it happen, but not let it derail what I feel is in my best interest. And also what I found working, now that I've worked closely with somebody who I think is a strong introverted feeler and very insensitive at times, I actually find the extroverted feeling to be a positive for me, because I can sometimes pick up on, emotional needs that people have. And even though I don't necessarily like personally feel super emotional about their feeling, the knowledge of what they're feeling I can use to my advantage, because I can, if I'm in a presentation and I notice, how people are kind of, their body language, how they're receiving what I'm saying, I can kind of, pick up on, oh, they think this is too boring, or, oh, this is a little too over the top, we need to pull it back a little bit, or we need to slow down, because I can like kind of see how people are reacting. Whereas this guy that I work with, he will totally just steamroll over somebody, be totally insensitive, and totally offend them. And even though he may be saying things that are logically true, I can see how the other person is offended by what he's saying, but he personally doesn't seem to see that. So it actually does work in my favor, but I do kind of sometimes wish it wasn't there, because then I would just be totally 100% kind of logically focused, at least from an introverted thinking perspective of like subjective logic. But yeah, I mean, that's the gist of it. And I'll give you another real practical example of extroverted feeling, though, before I kind of close this out. But when it comes to women, I was one of those guys. I grew up in a semi-religious family, and I was taught to be, respectable and what have you. But of course, then, you see how it's kind of all like the assholes and dickheads that are actually getting all the action. And when I was younger, it used to be easier for me to say, you know what, fuck it, I'm not going to be a nice person, I'm just going to do whatever I need to do to make things happen, and that's it, because that's the way it works. But as I've gotten older, I've started to I think part of it has to do with the extroverted feeling, but I've started to become more aware of, the long-term effects of what I do. And even though I may disagree with the way, pop culture or society deals with things or believes in things, I have to keep in mind that, as much as I dislike it or disagree with it, I do live within that world. And so I just have to make sure that, and accept the fact that there will be consequences if I try to kind of go against the grain or do things in a different way. But the extroverted feeling thing, as I've gotten older, in a sense, this used to be kind of frustrating to me, is because, I knew that if I would just be a complete dick in certain situations, I would actually do better with girls. But then the extroverted feeling kicks in and I can sense the emotional state of that girl. And even though I know what I could do, I know that if I just stopped caring and do whatever I wanted to do, then I could kind of get what I wanted to get. But that sense of, it got to the point where I literally just didn't even really want to fuck with their emotions and stuff, which I think in the long run will be good for me. But that's I think a really practical example of how extroverted feeling has definitely kind of changed the way that I perceive things and value things a little bit in life. Don't get me wrong, I'm still a dick sometimes, and I think actually, sometimes it's beneficial, especially when you're in, really serious business meetings, just depending on who you're dealing with. I try to think more long term, but you know, I'm a human just like everybody else, and it's interesting how all of these different personality types and the functions within them kind of work together to kind of balance people out. I think is really interesting. But yeah, that's my spiel on this. I didn't think it would be this long, but again, this is what happens when you're an introverted thinker and you're basically, you know, thinking about things faster than you can say them. So you're kind of, you know, sometimes I perfectly understand something in my head, but the words to describe it are just not there. They're just not available for me. And it's really frustrating because I see it so clearly in my head, but for people who, one of my coworkers is a hardcore extroverted thinker, and if I can't visually demonstrate this thing or articulate it in the perfect way, she's just like, I don't understand what you're talking about. So this recording is also me kind of thinking things through out loud, which is not a clean cut situation. It's a little as I'm sure you've noticed, I've been jumping around a lot, but that's pretty much it. That covers off the basics. If you have any questions, let me know, and I'll see if I can get to them or answer them. But would love to hear from anybody else who identifies as INTP. If anything I said kind of resonates with you, please leave it a comment. Let me know. And that's all I got. All right, till next time.